Good evening, everyone, and welcome to. There we go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Labour Union's event on shaping the new normal, the case for insourcing public services. My name is Joe Cox. I'm a political officer for Labour Unions. For those of you that don't know, Labour Unions is the collective voice of the 12 trade unions that are part of the Labour Party. We bring the collective voices of 4 million working people to the heart of the party. This is the fourth in a series of discussions about how trade unions and the Labour Party can work together to shape the new normal. This week, we will explore why the outsourcing first approach to public services is deeply flawed. Now, outsourcing or contracting out is when the government, either at a national or local level, hires an outside organisation to provide products or services. During the coronavirus crisis, the UK government has turbocharged outsourcing, when we know decades of evidence has shown that outsourcing tends to be bad for workers, taxpayers and the public. Various media reports have shown that over 1.7 billion has been spent by the UK government with private companies to manage the COVID-19 response. And last week, a new article was published, an investigation by The Guardian, where it's projected that 5 billion will be spent on contact tracing alone. The usual tendering processes have been bypassed and new deals have been signed. The likes of Serco have been hired for contact tracing, big accountancy firms have advised on the PPE logistics, and Amazon are delivering test kits. And in this conversation, we'll talk about how we tackle some of the challenges of outsourcing and how we begin to turn the tide on outsourcing. How do we campaign to bring local services back in-house? How do we make the arguments for investing in the public sector to employ staff directly? We've got a really good lineup of speakers. Rachel Reeves MP is the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office. We've got Jim Kennedy, who is a National Officer for Local Government for Unite the Union. We've got Rachel Harrison as well, who's a Public Services National Officer for the GMB. We hopefully will have Donna Rowe Merriman from Unison joining us later, although I think there's been some technical problems at her end. Please share this on social media. Please type a question into the chat box. Please keep the questions brief and comradely, and I'll do my best to air everyone's views and synthesize your questions. So first of all, let's go to 5 minutes from each speaker. We've got a fantastic lineup. I'm really pleased to start off by introducing Rachel Reeves, as I said, Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office. Over to you, Rachel.
Great. I hope you all hear me okay. And thank you very much, Joe, for inviting me to come and speak this evening. In my few minutes to you, I just talk about a bit of the work that I've been doing over the last 3 months since I was appointed as the Shadow Cabinet Office Minister in the Shadow Cabinet. But my interest in this area of outsourcing and insourcing goes back further than that. In the last Parliament, I chaired the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategies Select Committee. And as part of that, I chaired the inquiry looking at the collapse of Carillion. And it was through that that I think I got a first-hand experience, insight of the scale of the scandal of outsourcing and what it's doing to workers' terms and conditions, costs for taxpayers, and also costs down the supply chain with the way that many outsourcing firms treat smaller businesses within their supply chain. So this is an issue that I really am very passionate about changing and altering under a future Labour government. The issue of outsourcing has risen up the political agenda in the last few weeks because, as Joe said, so many of the essential parts of the response to the coronavirus pandemic have been outsourced to private sector firms, whether that's contact tracing, testing, the provision of free school meals, food vouchers. So much of that work is being done not by the public sector, where I think it belongs, but instead by private companies whose ultimate motive is to seek a profit for their shareholders. Our critique of government has been that during this crisis, they've been too slow to lock down, too slow to get PPE to the front line, and too slow to delivering testing, particularly for those people who work or reside in care homes. And wherever the failures occur, the private sector are not too far away from those failures. The only area I think the government has quick on in the course of this crisis is to hand out incredibly lucrative contracts to their friends in the private sector firms, including, as Joe said, Serco, Deloitte, Edenred, and others. And this is despite the fact that very recently Serco was fined £1 million by the government for failing to deliver on its own contracts to government. But that didn't stop it getting a contract worth 45 million, potentially rising to 90 million for contact tracing. Deloitte given the contract for testing, and we now know from the local lockdown and crisis that we're seeing in Leicester that during the course of this crisis, they hadn't been sharing their data on testing either with local GPs or with public health directors at a local level, which has only exacerbated the problems in Leicester and elsewhere in understanding the nature of the spread of this virus. So far now, we've established that £2.8 billion worth of taxpayers' money has been spent on outsourcing public services. And that figure is likely to rise probably substantially as more contract details are published by governments. I really do think that it is absolutely outrageous that yesterday the Prime Minister suggested that part of the reason for the scale of the deaths and the crisis that we've seen in our care homes is the responsibility of people who work in those care homes, people who work very often for less than real living wage, very often on 0-hour contracts, who don't get sick pay if they take time off at work, and so in many cases had to make terrible decisions about whether being able to put food on their table or to protect their own health. And I would say to the Prime Minister and to others in government, take responsibility for your own actions, for your own failure to deliver during this crisis, and don't pass on that responsibility to those people who are working on the front line, many of whom are your members. And that's what I want to turn to now, because I think the role of trade unions during this crisis has been absolutely crucial. Whether it's work on ensuring that proper health and safety provisions have been put in place in the workplace, or whether it's giving confidence to workers in our care homes, our schools and our hospitals to speak out about the experience that they are facing. Because it's only from that frontline first-hand evidence that the country gets to hear about the scale of the challenge that we're facing. So I want to thank you for the work that all of you and your reps are doing to give confidence to people on the front line to speak out. I know that we're running out of time. We've got other speakers to hear. I'll just end by saying Carillion wasn't just a bad apple. There is a systemic issue and failure in our outsourcing model. This government are too quick to believe the promises of the private sector and too slow to recognise the value of our public work, public ethos, and the knowledge, experience, and expertise that resides in our public sector. After this crisis, we can't go back to business as usual. We can't clap for the NHS and care workers on a Thursday night, or to celebrate the 72nd anniversary of the NHS, and then go back to paying people less than a living wage, to go back to 0 hours contracts of our care sector is based on. And so if anything can come out of what we've gone through in the last few months is that we recognise the value of those who work on the front line, who work in our public sector, and reward them and treat them accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was absolutely brilliant, and I think lots of people will really appreciate your positive words towards the role that the trade unions have played over the last few months. I think it's been incredibly hard for workers and their unions, obviously, over the last few months. But I think you're absolutely right that lots more people are hearing about the role of trade unions, the vital role of trade unions over the last couple of months, and hopefully that is one silver lining of this terrible crisis. Next, I'm going to bring in Jim Kennedy from Unite. Now, I think Jim's been having a bit of an issue tech-wise, so he didn't get to hear everything that Rachel said. But we'll give him a go, and hopefully, Jim, if you can respond, and then we will hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will work out, and So 5 minutes to you,
Joe. Can I just check if you can hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah. Okay, look, apologies. I'm obviously experiencing some technical difficulties here because apologies to Rachel, but I never actually got to hear a word of your contribution. So apologies for that. It's obviously something wrong technically with either my laptop or the connection. But look, thanks for the invite. And thanks for Labour unions scheduling is exactly the same time as Chelsea kicked off against Crystal Palace, with Chelsea being 1-0 up already as well. I hope everyone's safe and well and not taking any notice of the government's contradictory sort of advice on managing their safety during the coronavirus. But look, let me go on to the subject we're here to discuss tonight. And I'd like to start with two statements. First one is there should be no profiteering in the delivery of our public services. And secondly, outsourcing is bad for the workforce and bad for our communities. And we all know that there's a profit imperative built into each outsourced contract, whether it be 20 or 25%. And put bluntly, the private sector company will reduce the running costs by around that 20-25% to enhance the profits and pay dividends and eye-watering salaries in terms of CEO salaries. And outsourcing relies on bogus arguments about the value of competition as a driver for efficiency, quality improvements or innovation. And this ideological theory is overlaid with short-term cost-cutting agendas whereby companies undercut each other, reduce service quality, while shedding staff and slashing pay and terms and conditions. And the result, as we know, is a reduced service to the public, with workers on low pay, often requiring in-work benefits. So we in Unite have an unequivocal position. We want and expect all local authority services to be insourced or remain directly delivered. This means publicly owned, publicly run and democratically accountability. Services run in the public interest, not in the interest of wealthy investors or shareholders. I think the reason we're having a debate tonight is because the public are fed up seeing more and more of our public services being placed in the hands of the profiteers. And we can reference Carillion or rip-off rail fares, but it's actually everywhere within local government. In our care sector, in our waste sector, in our repair and maintenance sector, right throughout local government, it's rife. The Sercos, the Suez, Biffers, Veolias, and many others are leeching off public money. But like all things, we need to understand how we got here. And since 1992, there's been in excess of 13 separate legislative programmes that have prioritised or indeed sustained outsourcing. And they have doggedly underlined those bogus arguments about how competition improves service. So tonight we need to start to dismantle those. In terms of lower costs, running a service in-house is cheaper than outsourcing. It removes the cost of managing the contract and the dividends paid to shareholders. And to emphasise the toxic nature of this, we saw Carillion continue to pay shareholders huge sums while racking up enormous debts. They talk about better quality, but councils that are bringing services in-house give poor performance by the contractor as the most common reason. Many councils are already very efficient, therefore it's hard to cut costs without damaging the service. Private providers have misled councils or underestimated how much it will cost for them to provide a service, and they end up cutting back on quality after the contract has been signed. Councils, therefore, do not get what they're paid for. They claim better jobs, terms and conditions. Again, our experience within local government and right across the public sector is that to deliver their profit imperative, contractors slash services and workforce pay terms and conditions. Our members tell us they're fed up with the multiple layers of terms and conditions and pay, inequality and unfairness, insecure work, no training, development and very poor pension provision. And we know that trade union activists, for instance, are often singled out for speaking out against sharp practices. Risk. This is often used as a rider to outsource Risk is often used as a rider to outsource. It's baffled me, this. The contractor takes on no risk. We saw with Carillion and Virgin Trains that the risk never leaves the public sector. Contractors go bust. Contractors can actually walk away from contracts. So where is the risk? A council is obliged to deliver statutory services, so the risk always remains with the council. Should they outsource a service because it is them that are legally bound to deliver? And in terms of accountability, services run in-house are overwhelmingly more accountable to their users and staff. Local councils are democratic organisations. We elect councillors to serve us. They are obliged to answer to us. And outsourcing raises serious concerns about governance, transparency and accountability. So by outsourcing services, councils are putting a statutory service beyond the scope of freedom of information legislation, public scrutiny boards, and indeed other democratic accountable processes. So having said that, we're here tonight to try and find out what we need. So within Unite, we say we need councils to introduce a general policy of insourcing first. This is an institutional assumption that all local authority services should be delivered in-house by the council and that all expiring contracts should result in insourcing. That insourcing first policy needs to be developed with full agreement and engagement with the trade unions, council officers, the community and political groupings. And that should include the introduction of a rolling calendar so that adequate plans can be made to allow insourcing as a workable option. It should identify areas through engagement with council officers and trade unions that would highlight areas of current failure and waste. It should set up good management structures. It should plan to build capacity and skills, very important issue. It should set out clear criteria for insourcing, and it should define and measure our old friend risk. It should also look at the very key area of access to finance, and it must bring the workforce on board. And underpinning this must be a strong social value procurement policy, and it must use the law to terminate contracts. So there's obviously a lot more that should be included in that insourcing first policy. But the point I'm trying to make tonight is such a policy is real life. It can be done. We just need the political will to get it done. And I'm happy to listen to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Very, very clear, very impassioned. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm really glad that that we was able to iron out those technical difficulties and you were able to set out the view of Unite the Union. Now, next up, Rachel Harrison from the GMB. Rachel, your 5 minutes starts now.
Right, thank you. Okay, so thanks for inviting me today. Just like to say, obviously, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a topic that's close to all of our hearts at GMB. And, you know, thank you to Rachel for highlighting it, as she did at the beginning, the role of the trade unions, the important role that we've played, especially during COVID and this huge pandemic that we've all been battling, you know, and it's not just us sat here in the safety of our homes, it's our members that have been out there on the front line fighting for their members. So yeah, thanks for that recognition, and a bit of thanks as well again to you, Rachel, for the work you've been doing, raising the huge crisis we've got with PPE. You know, the fights you've been having for our members to do with the out of date and the quality stock, and our huge concerns that we're nowhere near addressing what we need to do should we be heading into a second peak or the winter crisis. So thank you for the work you've done on that. It has been an absolute battle from day one with everything, you know, with guidance, with PPE, with pay, with testing. We are still fighting to this day. And it's thanks to us all coming together and all working together that we've made some real achievements. I think the social care, to echo the comments that you started off with as well on social care, the statement made by the Prime Minister yesterday, blaming the blame at the door of the care providers, is absolutely appalling. They've already tried to pin the blame on the staff. Now they're trying to pin the blame on the care providers. Well, they need to stand up and take some responsibility, because they were late issuing guidance in care homes, and they were late. You know, they've still not provided full sick pay for people. They were late getting the testing in there. And, you know, a lot of these are being operated by care providers, private care providers. So the local authorities haven't been able to intervene in a way that they should have. But anyway, I'm here to talk about NHS and privatisation and outsourcing in the NHS as such. It's something that we've campaigned for long and hard about, the insourcing. It's part of our central campaigning to challenge all privatisation and outsourcing. At the end of 2019, so just prior to COVID hitting, we did a bit of research into the extent of privatisation in the NHS. And the amount of contracts that were awarded had almost doubled. So in 2015, there was £1.9 billion worth of contracts that doubled up to 3.6 billion by the end of 2018. So by the end of November 19, there were another 3.3 billion pounds worth of contracts. So there's this constant increase that we're seeing in contracts going out, despite the Tories putting all over their manifesto that the NHS is not for sale. If you dig under the surface of that, you will see it absolutely is for sale for them. So we've long campaigned against outsourcing in the NHS. One of our big things was to scrap the 2012 Health and Social Care Act that threw open the door to privatisation in the NHS, specifically with regards to Section 75, and we want to see that completely scrapped. Outsourcing has proven time and time again that it's bad for patients and it's bad for staff. Services are slashed in order to increase profits. Pay and terms and conditions of staff are driven down. Again, it's all about the profits and not about the people. Obviously, we all know it's been an issue for many, many years, but I just want us to take a minute just to look at the COVID period. It's the one period that's prevalent in our minds right now, and some of the stuff that's being faced out there in the NHS. So as a group of 14 recognised trade unions for the NHS, we immediately got on board working together collectively, regular meetings with the Department of Health, Public Health England, NHS employers, right across the board to make sure that our staff in the NHS had their pay and terms and conditions protected, that any guidance that was being issued for the public, we could find a way of incorporating that to protect the staff as well. We've still a long way to go, and it's been an absolute battle right along the way. But the key there is that we've been at the table, we've been having those discussions, and we've been trying to influence. Take a step towards looking at the shot of privatisation in the NHS. It's such a fragmented system. There are that many different employers now operating beneath the NHS logo. So there's a lot of people walking around with an NHS logo on, but they're not actually employed by the NHS on NHS terms and conditions. And I'm talking about the likes of ISS and Mighty and Interserve and many, many others that employ people doing some of the most important jobs in our healthcare settings. So these are your cleaners, your porters, all the people that do the facilities, you know, even your private ambulance drivers, the patient transport services. These are all operated by private employers who are paying generally the minimum wage. Lucky if we can get the living wage. COVID has shone a real light on the disparity between the terms and conditions between the staff. We've had to fight for statutory sick pay. It's not a given. We first started COVID battling government to pay statutory sick pay from day one, so you didn't have to stand to your first 3 days. We continue to have the battle to get contractors to pay statutory sick pay, full sick pay for their staff. People cannot afford to choose between putting food on the table and heating their homes and going into work, potentially ignoring government advice to self-isolate. They just cannot do that. It flies in the face of any infection prevention and control advice. Without a commitment for full sick pay for all, it's pointless. The guidance is pointless. The track and trace system is pointless and testing is pointless. So SSP is a huge issue for all of our contractors operating in the NHS. Again, we've been able to secure for NHS workers agenda for change, protection of pay for all self-isolation requirements, if you need to shield. Again, our contractors, so our most vital workers in those hospitals, keeping those hospitals going, have been denied that. PPE, they've been excluded from the PPE because they weren't deemed as needing it. They weren't required in the areas that they were working in. We've seen a horrendous amount of bullying from managers telling our staff, our members, that you don't need PPE. You know, cleaners don't need it. It's only if you're a doctor. There's only limited supplies. If we give it to you, there'll be none for the nurses. There'll be none from the doctors. Threatening behaviour, threatening with disciplinary action if you choose to wear PPE. You might be cleaning a COVID ward or helping to transport patients from one ward to another, and yet you're being denied PPE. These things are still ongoing. And then there's the general issues with outsourcing that we see day in, day out, irrelevant of COVID. Constant pay errors, people not being paid the money that they should be, constant bullying by managers, harassment and victimisation, especially if you're a union rep. How dare you speak up for the staff? You know, contracts are being extended throughout COVID without going through the proper process because it's just easier to do that. And we can't be focusing our attention on examining those extreme pressures and workloads. So why are we in this situation? Well, it's simple. The system's fragmented. Whereas in the NHS, we can collectively bargain in on behalf of everyone and make sure the standards are up to scratch and people are kept accountable. You can't do that with a million different private contractors operating very differently side by side. So you might have got the likes of ISS with contracts at many different hospitals. They're all operating under separate different local agreements. So it makes it impossible to bring that all together and monitor what's working and what isn't. It happens because these are low paid workers. It happens because they're predominantly BAME and they're fearful of their contracts being terminated if they stand up and speak out. So there's no proper link between the contractors and the trust and government. So nobody is ultimately held accountable for when things go wrong. And we've got lots of examples of where it's gone wrong. So what do we do? I'll finish on this one. So what do we do? DNB has made our Focus Go Public campaign. A key ask of that is about challenging all outsourcing and privatisation right across the public sector, but specifically so in the NHS, and that comes with scrapping Section 75 of the Health and Social Care Act. We need to get the public and community on board. We need to help them understand who's hiding behind the NHS logo. This is not the NHS they think it is, and it's our job to expose the reality of what's going off. We need to invest in the NHS and invest in the people. Getting people onto proper NHS terms and conditions and pay is ultimately investing in their future, and then it invests in the economy because they go out and they spend that money. It's simple maths. They feel secure in work, they will spend their wages and it boosts the economy. We must hold the government to account on this. This is exactly what happens when government are free to let rip on privatisation and open the doors to it. There's been an absolute failure throughout coronavirus to protect staff and protect patients and protect service users in hospital. by not protecting the staff at the very heart of our health centres. So these are your porters and your cleaners and your private contractors right throughout. Without protecting them, we aren't protecting the public. They failed on PPE, they failed on testing, and they failed on pay. And we need to hold this government to account on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. I think that set up the conversation really, really well. I think there's a huge level of agreement between trade unions and the party, which is good to see. We've touched upon issues of fragmentation, of profiteering, of transferring risk onto the public, with issues of low pay and the realities of working for some of these poor outsourced employers. We've also touched as well on the importance of the kind of the fragmentary nature of public health as a result of outsourcing, which has meant our response to the coronavirus crisis has been severely undermined. And of course, health and safety at work is another issue, which obviously makes that situation worse. So I think in terms of an overall view of what's the reality of outsourcing, you know, we've got a good, we're on a similar page on that. To try and bring in some questions from viewers, one of the major ones that has come up has been about people's about the public's response to this, in terms of making our voices and our criticisms of outsourcing resonate with the public, for that to be a kind of a widely understood, for all these issues to be widely understood, and the importance of it, and as well how outsourcing leads ultimately to a worse deal for taxpayers and service users. Now, all the polling that I've seen shows that the public don't really like outsourcing. They're quite skeptical about it. They understand, you know, they experience these things. They know, they have friends and they have colleagues that work for outsourced companies. How do we turn that broad-based feeling that outsourcing is not really a good thing into real concrete change? And that's quite an open question, which I'll throw open. You know, put your hand up if you want to go first, but there's a kind of broad open question about, you know, I think the public are broadly with us. They broadly understand the problems with the outsourced model. How do we take them? How do we amplify that voice? How do we make the changes that we want to see? I will pick on you. Yeah. So, thank you, Rachel. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think the best way to do it is, as you say, Joe, to show why it matters for the services that are delivered. So coronavirus is perhaps more obvious. For example, the fact that the lawyers are doing the testing, but they're not sharing it with GPs and local authorities, health directors at the local level, means it's impossible to really know where the virus is most prevalent. And you expect during this for people to work together. But Deloitte only do what is in their contract to do, whereas our local authorities and our hospitals and our care homes always go above and beyond what they're asked to do. And that's because there's a different motive. There's a motive and the purpose of service on the one hand, and then there's a profit motive on the other. So I think that that's the heart of it, really. People want to know what difference it's going to make to their life when they need the support of the NHS or our care sector. I think the other point is about value for money for taxpayers. And to deliver public services, you obviously need to invest in workers, the equipment, the space, whether it's hospitals or care homes or whatever it is. But there's also going to be an additional cost when you're outsourcing services, and that's a return to shareholders, which you don't have if the services are delivered in-house. And it means there's more money to go to those on the front line or to deliver a better service if you're not having to pay a load of money out in returns to shareholders. So I think it's about linking to delivering a better service, a more joined up service, but also about means that we reinvest in our public services rather than going to shareholders and direct of companies. I mean, at Carillion, the chief executive was paid hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. He was still being paid a bonus the year the company went bankrupt, and they're paying dividends every single year while they weren't funding their pension obligations. So that doesn't happen when services are run in-house, because the vocation of those who work in public service is to provide public service.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Rachel Harrison, would you like to follow up on that?
Yes, I think thinking back the question, how do we take the public with us and try and help us make change? We need to first of all make sure they understand the true extent of privatisation. Again, like just specifically referring to the NHS, a lot of people don't understand who it is that's operating beneath the NHS logo, because everyone's got the NHS logo. So you presume the person that is taking you to and from hospital is employed by the NHS. Not necessarily. So we have a job. And as Rachel was just saying then about the amount of money that gets siphoned away from the front line into the pockets of people, we've got a job of work of there to do. And I know there's a lot of different organisations that do expose this stuff, but we need to get the facts out there to the public first to make them understand. Public services, they're all key worker heroes. We've been clapping every Thursday night since coronavirus. We've all recognised what key worker heroes are. And it's about getting the public now to follow on from the Thursday night clapping. So these are the statistics. This is the reality on the front line. Now you need to do something. So in health, they can get involved. These contracts come up for renewal, although they're coming up 5 and 7 year terms now rather than 2 and 3 year terms, but they do come up for renewal. Members of the public in your local community, they can get involved. You can contact the local health boards, contact the trusts, contact the CCGs, ask them the real cutting questions about how much are you paying this provider? What are you getting for that service? What would the calculations be if this was provided in-house? How is it better value for money? So members of the public can get involved that way, because they will listen to the public a lot more than they'll listen to the likes of me. So just one suggestion.
Thanks, Rachel. Jim, I'm just checking. Are you able to hear me? No. I think that's a no. I think that's a no.
Joe, I mean, I saw you signalling. Are you signalling to me?
Yeah, are you able to hear me though?
No, I've not heard a word anyone said tonight, so I've no idea the thrust of the debate, what direction it's going or anything. But I'm happy to make another contribution just to emphasise, over the last 4 or 5 months, the nature of the essential work that local authority workers and, of course, NHS workers and all public sector workers have undertaken. And it's a question, really, and it's about public support. And our care workers, our refuse collectors, our the workforce who's worked in the cemeteries and crematoria, do the public, are they willing to accept that there are companies making a profit out of those jobs during this crisis? It's obscene. It's obscene. And it has to stop. The pillaging of public funds by these charlatan companies has to stop. And the way you stop it is like the way I ended my last contribution, with political will. And I haven't heard Rachel's contribution, and me and Rachel are chums, so no doubt we'll have this conversation again. But it's political will. We have to have a clear narrative about the insourcing of public services. The Labour Party in opposition need to have that. Now, there was a document, an insourcing first document was produced just before the last election. I thought it was an excellent document, by the way. Unite have also produced a wonderful document. There you are, which we're willing to circulate to anyone who wants a copy. And it's a toolkit and a roadmap how to insource. Even though we're not in government, it sets out the legislation that can be used, the tests that can be used. So it is doable, but we need Labour councils, council leaders to show that leadership to bring those services in-house. No more profiteering out of public services. It must stop. That's my contribution.
Jim, given that you can't hear anything that other people have said, that's really good. See, I'm trying to mime really good now to Jim. Well,
I just heard that remarkably. I don't know why all of a sudden, but yeah, I mean, look, this is a really, really important debate, and it's one that is that Unite members, and I know GMB members and Unison members who work in the public sector feel passionately about. And the workforce that work for these organisations that have come in on contractors' terms and conditions. I had a meeting of our refuse collectors from different companies, and there was a contractor in the southwest where they had 5 tiers of terms and conditions because the contract had been changed so many times. And we're just in the process of conducting a ballot on pay for our local authority members. Now, that's fine for those that are directly employed, either on the craft agreement or the NJC agreement. But we've also got members in those outsourced companies that's pay is affected by what we do in local government. It's a diminishing number because they have legacy terms and conditions, 2P terms and conditions, but their colleagues have inferior terms and conditions, doing exactly the same job, exactly the same hours, at exactly the same place. And that's unacceptable. That's totally unacceptable. And that's how they make their profits. That's how they build in their profit imperative.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. Two really important points there. I think one, obviously, that it doesn't mean that although that the legislation, the national legislation, isn't terribly helpful for us, it doesn't mean that services cannot be brought back in-house at a local level. And trade unions and labour groups in local government can work together to do that. And that is a good thing, and it does happen. And as a result, those services generally improve and offer better value for money as a result. I think the other thing that is really important to emphasise is that these 2-tier, 3-tier, 4-tier, 5-tier workforces that you spoke about, Jim, obviously it makes it harder for trade unions to have a collective voice and to organise collectively when there are so many different layers and different tiers of workers. Just want to bring in a few more comments, if possible. Teresa says, personal stories, absolutely. Obviously, stories from the workplace, stories from workers at the sharp end of this. They are always more powerful than listening to hacks like me. Another good question is coming from Alison. So I'd like to throw this open to the panel. And I think this is a really good question, actually, which and I think the government sort of relies on these fears to justify outsourcing. And Alison asked, would it have been possible to crank up our contact tracing, our response to COVID, without outsourcing? Now, I think it's a good question. I think I know what the answer is going to be from the panelists, but if you could talk to that would be really good. And I think Rachel Harrison, you're probably best place for this one. Is that right?
I don't know if I'm best placed, but the shortest answer is, so would it have been possible to crank up our response without outsourcing? Yes, short answer, it would have. And I think, obviously, we've all got the benefit of hindsight, you know, so we do have to have a little bit of understanding of how some of this has been dealt with, because none of us knew what we were dealing with. But I think it's been an absolute, all it's done is shone a light on how fragmented our system is. The fact that we had to take back central control of PPE and logistics, if that had been under our control, we'd have got that out. We'd have been able to get, you know, we wouldn't have had to take it all back into central control, because we'd have already run it. We'd have known what was there. We'd have known how to get it to where it needed to be quicker. We had to campaign to get private hospital beds brought back into NHS control so that they were available should they be needed. The testing, we've got stories of NHS labs laying empty whilst all the testing, and I don't pretend to be a scientist or understand how it all works, but the testing facilities and the equipment that was needed was all given out to private contractors, while we had NHS labs laying empty, ready to do the work. The contact trace centre, as we've already said, is now out to a different private employer. And as unions, we're desperately trying to get in to speak to those staff. So no, I don't believe we did need it to be privately outsourced. I believe if we had central control of everything, we'd have been able to respond to the pandemic a lot more efficiently than we have done. And I hope that that will come out of any inquiry or recommendations at the end of all this.
Brilliant, very clear. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel Reeves, would you like to add anything on that?
I'll just add something briefly. It would have involved recruiting additional people to the public sector, but the public sector could have done just as easily as the private sector did. But as the other Rachel said, it could have been done in a way that coordinated the whole effort rather than the fragmented effort that we saw. And I don't know if it necessarily needs to be done at a centralised Whitehall level. It could be done, and we should have much used better our local knowledge, because when you're doing contact tracing, it really helps if you've got people that know the communities in which you are tracing. So, you know, I'm an MP in West Leeds. If somebody calmly in my constituency contracted the virus and had been to a pub on Armory Town Street, shopping centre in Kirkstone, and then we've got the number 42 bus into town, people in Leeds would have an idea of what I was going on about in a way that you wouldn't if you were in a different part of the country. And yet the government approach and the Serco approach is to have centralised call centres with anyone picking up the phone to anyone in the country. And that doesn't make sense at all. So actually, you also neglect and lose that local knowledge and understanding. And quite early on in the pandemic, I spoke to some health experts about the knowledge that they had built up through years of doing contact tracing. Sure, not on this scale, but for food poisoning, for tuberculosis, for sexually transmitted diseases. They had expert knowledge of how to do this in a sensitive way that the government totally bypassed to create a different way of responding and tracing. And I think we would have had a much better and fully functioning contact tracing service by now, as well as the testing service. And actually, one of the reasons why the government are not meeting their 200,000 tests a day for now is that testing is located in communities still, and you're still requiring people to travel out of town to get to the testing in a way that the NHS has never required. The testing for the NHS has been in the NHS, but testing for the community has not been in the community. It's been out of town car parks in the case of Leeds, I think junction 42 of the M1 or something, which is not accessible for people in my community who don't have cars or any way of accessing it. So I believe that not only could we have the public response, but it would be a better response, better outcomes, especially if it utilised local knowledge and experience.
Thanks, Rachel. Jim, do you want to add anything on?
Me, Joe? Okay, thank you. I mean, Joe's kindly sent me a text with the current direction of debate where it says, is it possible to crank up public sector capacity at short notice without outsourcing? Well, look, what we set out, what I tried to set out in terms of the initial contribution was that we should have a institutional assumption of insourcing first. And if we adopt that and we have a rolling calendar, then it's not short notice. You know, you have the rolling calendar of when contracts are expiring, and then you can build that capacity. I know I've heard the arguments many times, we would insource it, but we haven't got a depot, we haven't got the skills capacity, we haven't got that. Well, build it. If you have the rolling program, the rolling calendar, you can see what's required at a certain date. And of course, you know, if you're bringing the service back in-house, you're bringing the skills back in-house, you're bringing the expertise back in-house. You might not have the fixtures and fittings, you may have to supply those. But we've got wonderfully skilled workers delivering public services, albeit for a private contractor. So bring them back in-house. We have the capacity, the workforce is there. It just needs the will and the structure through a proper, thought-out, structured, in-house first program. And it can be done. And just in case I don't get another chance to make a contribution, because obviously because of the technical difficulties, I want to give a shout out for We Own It, who do wonderful jobs in exposing the abuses of the private sector in the delivery of public services. It's a great organisation. There's nearly 200 people on this, I can see at the moment. Go onto their website. It's extremely informative. It will shock you, some of the abuses of the private sector in terms of the delivery of public services. So look, one final point I'll make on a point I made earlier on. Look, during the pandemic that's still continuing, we've had to deal obviously with the local government employers in getting guidance out and, you know, getting the correct advice to our members. And we've worked constructively with the local government employers, which is always great when you've got a national bargaining machine. The biggest difficulty we had is with those outsourced companies delivering public services on PPE, on furlough, now on redundancies. They're charlatans. They're exploiting, terribly exploiting this situation. And if anything should concentrate our minds about the true sort of ethos of these companies, it's their actions over the last 4 or 5 months. So when we finally get through this, I'd like local authorities to look at their contractors and see how they've behaved and put them on notice that that service is coming back in-house.
Thank you, Jim. Passionate and clear as ever. I just want to take a couple more questions and comments, or relay a couple more questions and comments before I give the two Rachels an opportunity to say whatever they would like to say to wrap up the conversation. Jim Livesey says that what about the skills and scale of private organisations? I think the other Jim Kennedy gave a good answer to that there. Basically, the skills exist within the workforce, and the scale exists within the public sector. So these things can be built in-house, and obviously rolling contracts where you build this capacity over time is the way to do that. Brian Eden made a very good point, which is that the Welsh Labour government has taken a different approach and has implemented their contact and test, trace and protect system in Wales. It's been an in-house public sector effort, and apparently is performing comparatively better. So thank you for that, Brian. So now over to the Rachels. We've got about 3 minutes or so before we're due to finish. So this is your time to kind of knit anything together, or leave us with any thoughts about perhaps what we do next, and where you think that we should take the campaigns, where you think we should be looking to build in the future. Rachel Harrison is nodding more, so I think maybe go to you next, Rachel. See, enthusiasm gets you in trouble sometimes.
No, that's absolutely fine, and I'll be quick so that Rachel can close up. Basically, just to finish it up, let's call it out. Where we're seeing bad practice in privatisation, as members of the public call it out, specifically in the health service, there are plenty of really good health community, local groups, such as Health Campaigns Together and Keep Our NHS Public. Get involved in their campaigns. Where the health unions are running campaigns, turn up on the picket lines, turn up at the protests, write to the trust, get involved, do anything you can. For us at GMB, I'm going to plug our petition. All you have to do is Google scrap Section 75 GMB. It's a petition to the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, basically calling for an end to privatisation. So please sign that petition and share it. That's it for me. I will let Rachel finish.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So over the last 3 months and in the months ahead, my approach and my plan is to hold the government to account for the decisions that they are making, including on the outsourcing of public services and the way in which that is resulting in worse services for the public and less value for money for the taxpayers. But one thing that hasn't come up today, but I think is important, is about so many of the contracts that are being handed out are to friends and donors of Conservative Party ministers and MPs, and those conflicts of interest also need to be shone on. I'm working with the owners and some the newspapers who are interested in those issues, and we're keen to work with trade union colleagues on that as well. The Labour Party and the Labour movement also will and need to work together over the next few years as we develop our policies, both for local elections, but also for the next general election as well, to make sure that we have policies that are popular and attractive to voters, but also work with those who depend on public services and those who work in our public services as well. And I'll just finish on this note about lessons to be learned from the coronavirus. I don't want to go back to the sort of society and economy and approach to public services that we had before this crisis. This crisis has shone a spotlight on some of the terms and conditions in which people who are delivering public services are having to work under, whether that's the lack of sick pay, a lack of a living wage that you can afford to live and support your family on, or its precarious nature of so much of the particular low paid work in the public sector because of the growth and the increase in outsourcing. So we need to work together, as Jim and Rachel say, to reveal the extent of that, the impact that it's having on workers and public services, and develop a Labour alternative which has public service and public service ethos at its heart. A very different approach and proposal from what we've seen under the Conservatives with their austerity over the last 10 years and their presumption that the private sector is always the best. That's different to our values. Our values are rooted in public service and also on decent wages, terms and conditions for people who deliver them. And I hope we can work together on a Labour approach to this the next few years. I look forward to working with you, Joe, Tim, Rachel and others on this call this evening.
Fantastic. See, I was all ready to give a wrap-up speech along those lines, but Rachel's done it so much better than I ever could. So let's work together as a trade union and Labour Party movement, as one movement over the next 4 years to develop our thinking. Let's bring services in-house where we can, and let's win for working people. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. In a couple of weeks, we will have a conversation about the future of social care with Liz Kendall and Labour Trade Union Voices. So I really hope you join us for that. Make sure you sign up to our mailing list, labourunions.org.uk. Follow us on Twitter, Labour Unions UK, and like us on Facebook as well. Thanks so much to Rachel Harrison, to Rachel Reeves, to Jim Kennedy. Have a good evening. Stay safe. Thank you.